Hello, everyone. Kind of just a check-in video, week one, themes of week one. Um, Let me just reiterate the discussion board, weekly discussion board. You should start posting on that as early as you can in the week. If you leave it to the end, it will be of limited value because we do want to initiate some sort of discussion. I mean, some sort of back and forth should be going on in the discussion board where we actually share our ideas, comment on each other's ideas. And if you wait till the very end of the week to do that, it won't happen. So let me just encourage you to get started on the readings, just enough that you actually know enough about them to begin to comment on them. You don't have to feel totally in command of material to begin to comment on it and share your ideas. This what you see before you is just a very, very basic simplification of the kind of ideas that are introduced in week one of the course. Kant's moral philosophy is a very large and complex thing, and utilitarianism, although I think it's less challenging to understand, is also a very large and complex thing. For the purposes of this course, which is an applied ethics course, not an exploration of the basis of moral philosophy, I think it's fully justified to try to boil these things down in a certain way to simple rules or simple guidelines when we're trying to make moral decisions, which I think is more or less what we do in everyday life. That is, when we're using moral philosophy to come to a moral decision, we aren't going into the great depths and the complex questions that emerge when we're looking into moral theory. We try to follow general guidelines. And I think that these are pretty close to, I think, what would be generally accepted as the kind of moral guidelines of Kantianism and utilitarianism. One of the things you need to know looking at Kant is what he means by a categorical imperative. And I've tried to characterize the content of both the first and second versions of the categorical imperative there under Kantianism. The first about universalizability, the second about respect for persons. The second one, I think, can be expressed in many ways. That we must never treat a person like a thing, that we must never disrespect a person would be another one. That we must always treat a person as an end in themselves and never as a means to an end, which is actually closer to what Kant actually says in the groundwork, in the excerpt that I gave you. I think these rules become quite useful when put in this way. That is, the first one, that whatever we do, we must be willing to stand behind our action in a way. And whatever the rule by which we are acting, what he calls our maxim of action, must be something that is universalizable. That is, something that could serve as a universal law, so that if it can't serve as a universal law, we know we shouldn't do it. We know that to do the thing would be unethical. And we know that when we're dealing with people or anything involving persons, that we must never treat them as objects. We must never exploit them. We must never do anything that offends their dignity as persons. I think those are pretty good rules to follow, actually. Utilitarianism can also be put in many different ways. And I think really it only has one. You only need to formulate it in one way, and that's what we must always do that which results in the greatest overall happiness. And clearly, I am trying to avoid the cliche, right? I am. Which is, it's perfectly true that we should always do that which results in the greatest good for the greatest number. But as a teacher, I always try to avoid the cliched version of it, because I think cliches, which in themselves, or the formulation is perfectly correct. It's just cliches tend to make us lazy. So, but there's nothing wrong with acknowledging it. That's pretty much the same thing. Greatest good for the greatest number. What I found in thinking about this and teaching for many years to students, or what I've concluded for myself at least, is that these things are very familiar to us. That is, these moral guidelines are actually quite familiar to us, that we might not have heard them actually articulated. They might not have been brought to the front of our minds in this way, but we're all familiar with them because we're moral persons. That is, we already, to a certain extent, follow these guidelines, I think, without even knowing that we're following them most of the time. But what's quite interesting is the fact that they do come in conflict with one another, and that's something that will become clear in the ethics of autopilot. That is, that if we are really committed to producing the greatest overall amount of happiness, that may in some cases entail treating a person like a thing. And I think it becomes very clear. I mean, for instance, when you do the moral machine test, or moral machine survey, not a test, having to do with the ethics of autopilot, you will see that immediately, that utilitarianism and Kantianism may ultimately be incompatible, which is really interesting, I think, because I do think that we are all to some extent Kantians and all to some extent utilitarians. So I'm just checking in, as I will periodically, because I make videos. That's the main way that I communicate with you. I am sure that I'm repeating myself from other videos, but that's okay too. I mean, teachers repeat themselves, and sometimes it's okay to hear the same thing more than once because you're trying to learn. So, so on the one hand, I apologize for being tedious, and on the other hand, well, sometimes teachers are tedious. So, again, if you have any questions in this course ever, that is, if you ever want some clarification, want to discuss the material, have a practical question about assignments or things like that, please feel free to contact me at the email or the cell phone number provided.